The wind howled outside, a bitter January beast clawing at the warped windows of their old family home in rural Georgia. It was 2025, and the chill seeped through the walls, curling around Haley's bare ankles like an unwanted lover. At 24, she felt the weight of duty pressing into her bones. 18 years of shared meals, shared fights, shared silences with her stepsisters, Lauren and Madison, and their stepbrother, Hunter. The house creaked under its own history, a sagging relic of their stitched-together family. And tonight, it felt smaller than ever. Restlessness simmered beneath her skin, a quiet fire she couldn't name, flickering hotter as the night deepened. She stood in the kitchen, the linoleum cold against her feet, her breath fogging faintly in the dim light. The oven, an ancient rust-streaked thing, had betrayed them again, its door jamming shut after Lauren's half-hearted attempt to bake cornbread. Now, Haley and Lauren were tangled in a ridiculous struggle, bent over the beast, skirts riding up as they tugged at its stubborn handle. Her thighs prickled in the draft, the hem of her cotton skirt grazing higher than she'd meant, exposing pale skin to the frigid air. Lauren muttered something sharp, her blonde hair spilling over her shoulder, but Haley barely heard. Her focus frayed, her body taut with the effort, until the creak of the kitchen door snapped her upright. Hunter stepped in, his broad frame filling the threshold, a gust of icy wind trailing him. His flannel hung loose, unbuttoned just enough to reveal the hard line of his collarbone, damp with sweat despite the cold. He'd been outside, wrestling with the generator, and his dark hair clung to his forehead in messy strands. His eyes, gray like storm clouds, swept the room, then landed on them. On her. Haley felt the shift, a jolt that rooted her where she stood. His gaze slid down, slow and deliberate, tracing the curve of her legs where the skirt had hitched up, lingering on the soft hollow behind her knee. A forbidden hunger flashed there, raw and unmasked, and her stomach tightened, a delicious ache blooming low. Her breath caught, a shallow hitch she couldn't hide. She straightened, the oven forgotten, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirt down, though the gesture felt futile under that look. 18 years they'd lived together, shared bathrooms, late-night talks, the blur of adolescence, and never once had she seen him like this. Not as Hunter, the boy who'd teased her over burnt toast, but as something else, something dangerous. Her pulse thudded in her ears, loud enough to drown the wind, and she wondered if he heard it too. He moved closer, boots heavy on the floor, and the air thickened, charged with a current she couldn't name. "Need help?" His voice was low, rough from the cold, but she barely registered the words. Lauren huffed, still yanking at the oven, oblivious to the shift, but Haley couldn't tear her eyes from him. He knelt beside them, close enough that she felt the heat rolling off him, a stark contrast to the chill biting her skin. His arm brushed hers as he reached for the handle, and her fingers, unthinking, grazed his hand. The touch was fleeting, calluses against her softness, but it seared through her, a spark that raced up her arm and settled deep in her chest. She froze, her mind a storm of guilt and want. This was Hunter, her stepbrother, the boy who'd patched her knee when she fell off her bike at 10, who'd slept on the couch beside her during thunderstorms. But now, his nearness unraveled her. She felt the weight of his hand hovering near hers, the faint scent of pine and motor oil clinging to him, and her body responded against her will, nipples tightening beneath her thin sweater, a flush creeping up her neck. She imagined those hands elsewhere, sliding up her thigh, and the thought was a knife, sharp with shame and thrill. The oven groaned as he pried it open, freeing Lauren with a grunt, but Haley barely noticed. Her world narrowed to the space between them, the inches where their breaths mingled, frosty and warm at once. He stood, towering over her now, and their eyes locked again. His pupils dilated, a dark pool she could drown in, and she wondered if he felt it too. This pull, this sin they'd never dared name. Her lips parted, dry and aching, but no words came. The cold air pressed in, heavy with their history, with the forbidden thing blooming between them, and she knew she'd never see him the same way again. The night stretched on, a slow, relentless pull that frayed Haley's edges. The kitchen held its breath, the chill seeping through the cracked window panes, warring with the oven's fading warmth, a heat that clung to the air like a memory. Lauren had stormed off minutes ago, muttering about the cold and the useless oven, leaving Haley alone with Hunter. The silence was a living thing, thick and pulsing, wrapping around her as she stood by the counter, her fingers tracing its chipped edge. She felt him before she saw him, his presence a weight, a magnet drawing her in despite every warning screaming in her skull. He lingered near the oven, wiping his hands on a rag, but his movements were slow, deliberate, like he was stalling. His flannel hung open, the faded red fabric stretched across his chest, and she couldn't stop staring. Those hands, steady, rough from freeing them, hovered too close to her hips as he stepped nearer, close enough that the cold couldn't shield her from the heat radiating off him. Her restraint, already threadbare, snapped like a twig underfoot. She reached out, her hand trembling as it settled on his chest, fingers splaying over the soft flannel. His pulse thudded beneath her palm, strong and erratic, mirroring her own, and the sensation was a jolt, electric, forbidden, alive. The boundary between them crumbled, not with a crash, but a sigh, a slow melting of the invisible wall built over 18 years. His breath hitched, a faint sound that vibrated through her, and then his hands were on her, tentative at first, brushing her waist. She pressed closer, her body acting before her mind could catch up, and their forms melded, a tangle of limbs and heat in the dim light. Her senses drowned in him, the scratch of his stubble as her cheek grazed his jaw, rough and intoxicating, the piney scent of him, sharp and earthy, filling her lungs, the warmth where his thigh pressed against hers, a slow burn that spread like wildfire. Her skirt bunched higher as she shifted, the fabric catching between them, and she didn't care, couldn't care, lost in the feel of him. Her fingers curled into his shirt, tugging him down, and his mouth found hers. Not a kiss yet, just a brush of lips, dry and hesitant, testing the edge of this abyss. The contact was a spark, igniting a hunger she'd buried deep, and she leaned into it, her lips parting as the kiss deepened. His tongue traced hers, slow and deliberate, and a moan slipped from her throat, unbidden, raw. Her hands slid up, threading through his hair, the damp strands cool against her fevered skin, and she pulled him closer, needing more. His grip tightened, one hand splaying across her lower back, the other skimming her thigh, and the touch was a revelation, every nerve alight, every inch of her awake. The kitchen faded, the cold irrelevant, as their bodies pressed tighter. Her breasts flattened against his chest, the thin sweater no barrier to the heat building between them, and she felt the hard planes of him, the strength coiled beneath his skin. Her thigh brushed his, a fleeting friction that sent a shiver racing up her spine, and she arched into him, chasing the sensation. Shame flickered, a dying ember in the back of her mind. 18 years. He's Hunter, this is wrong. But it dissolved under the weight of her need, replaced by a pull so deep it felt like fate. Her breath came in gasps, mingling with his, and she tasted salt on his lips, a trace of sweat that made her dizzy. He shifted, guiding her back until the counter dug into her hips, a cold shock against the fire of her skin. His hand slid higher, beneath her skirt, fingers grazing the soft flesh of her inner thigh, and she trembled, caught between surrender and awe. The moment unfurled in waves, his touch, her pulse, the unspoken shift as their eyes met, dark and unguarded. She saw herself reflected there, not the sister he'd known, but a woman undone, and it broke something in her, remade it stronger. Their bond, forged through years of shared roofs and quiet nights, turned electric, a current that stripped her raw and tethered her to him in a way she couldn't unfeel. Her head tipped back, exposing her throat, and his lips followed, a trail of heat that left her gasping. The world narrowed to this, to him, And she let go, fully, irrevocably, her heart pounding as the night swallowed them whole.